people say content. Contrary, not content, but contents have it. After clause 161, Amendment 225, Lord Moylan.
My Lords, continuing with the rather radical approach of debating an amendment which has already been debated in committee and hasn't just been introduced, and picking up on the theme of our debate immediately before we adjourned, I bring forward an amendment which seeks to address the question of the government's activities in interacting with providers when they seek to influence the providers as to what is shown on their sites. It might be a matter of interest that according to the Daily Telegraph, which I implicitly trust, only on Tuesday of last week, a judge in Louisiana, in the United States, issued an injunction forbidding a lengthy list of White House officials from making contact with social media companies to report misinformation. I say this not because I expect the jurisprudence of the state of Louisiana to have any great influence in your Lordship's House, but simply to show how sensitive and important this issue is. The judge described what he had heard and seen as one of the greatest assaults on free speech in the history of the United States. Now, we are not necessarily quite in that territory, nor does my amendment do anything so dramatic as to prevent the government from communicating with providers with a view to influencing their content. But it does, this is Amendment 225, it does require the Secretary of State to produce a report within 6 months of the passing of the Act, and every 6 months thereafter, in which he sets out any relevant representations His Majesty's government have made to providers which are intended to persuade or encourage a provider to do one of three things. One of them is to modify the terms of service of a regulated service in an effort to address misinformation or disinformation. One is to restrict or remove a particular user's access to accounts used by them. And the third is to take down, reduce the visibility of, or restrict access to content that is present or may be encountered on a regulated service. None of these things would be prohibited, none would be prevented by this amendment, but it would be required that His Majesty's government produce a report saying what it is they have done every 6 months. Now, very importantly, there is an exception in that there'd be no obligation on the Secretary of State to disclose any information publicly which affected national security. But he would be required, in that case, to make a report to the Intelligence and Security Committee here in Parliament. Now, my Lords, as I say, this is a very sensitive subject, and remarks made by the noble Baroness Lady Fox of Buckley in the previous debate referred in particular to this subject in connection with the pandemic. But while that is in the memory, there are other topics that may easily come up that need to be addressed, and where the government feels obliged to move and take action. We know nothing about those contacts because they're not instructions. They're not actions taken under law. They're simply nudges, winks, phone conversations with providers that have an effect, and the providers very often will act on them. And so requiring the government to make a report, to say what they've done, seems to be a modest, proportionate and appropriate means of bringing transparency to this exercise so that we all know what is going on. I'm happy to say that when this amendment was debated in committee, it found widespread support around the House. I'm hoping that it will find that support is still solid and strong, such that my noble friend will, perhaps as a modest postprandial bonus, be willing for a change to accept something proposed by one of his colleagues on his own benches, so that we can all rejoice as we go into a very long night? I beg to move.
Amendment proposed, insert the new clause as printed on the marshalled list.